Right. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Just give me 1 sec for the slides to be online. And now they should be accessible. How are we doing today? Are we good? Yeah? Are there any questions about what happened last week? No? Everything clear and understandable? Any questions about the grade improvement task? Everything fine? I mean, it looks fine. I saw a couple of your questions. They seem to be all right. Then, little recap. Tell me what a study is made of. What are the components of a study design? Without looking at your laptops at last week's slide. Think about the house. What is the house made of? Yeah?
Research questions.
Mm-hmm. Research question or research questions. That's the center, the family. Yeah? Yeah, the theoretical foundation. This is what we are going to talk about today. What else? Yeah? Yeah? Mm-hmm. What kind of methods are there? Walls would be methods. Like, what would be a very basic distinction about methods? Very basic stuff. Yeah?
Qualitative and quantitative.
Yeah, but even like across qualitative and quantitative studies, where would you put, for example, an interview, and where would you put a sort of t-test or something like that, even across that? What kind of methods are there? What kind of method is an interview? In which category of methods would that belong? Anyone? Yeah?
It was about collecting data and statistical analysis or evaluating whatever.
You're close, but yeah, one type of method would be data collection methods, and the other type of method would be data analysis methods. Now, in quantitative research, this would be statistical analysis, any kind of statistical analysis. In qualitative, it is more about textual or non-numerical data. Okay, and what was the roof of the house about? Yeah.
Quality criteria.
Perfect, quality criteria. Now, quality criteria is something we are not going to talk about until the end of the semester when we talk about evaluating qualitative research. But today we are talking about the foundation of the house, the foundation of our studies. We are talking about theoretical and philosophical positions. You could also call them philosophical stances, or epistemological stances, or ontological stances, or conceptual frameworks, a lot of different terms for what we are going to talk about today. We need to start at a very, very basic field, and the field that we are starting at is the field of philosophy, or the love of wisdom, which is a very basic translation of what philosophy is. And we can think about the field of philosophy, or we can sort of categorize the field of philosophy in different ways. For example, we can categorize it by time, things like ancient philosophy or something like that, and things like modern philosophy. That would be a categorization. You could sort of categorize philosophy by place, say things like European philosophy, or American philosophy, or West Asian philosophy, So you could also categorize it by place. Now, a common distinction of philosophy would be the one that is on there. It is the categorization of philosophy into 4 different fields. One is metaphysics, one is epistemology, one is logic, and one is axiology. For us, for today, for this whole semester, for your final reports, for most of the times we don't care that much about logic and axiology. These are fields of philosophy which are very interesting fields and important fields. But what we care about is metaphysics and a subfield of metaphysics, which is ontology, and epistemology, which is a field for itself, I'd say. Ontology, the subfield of metaphysics, is concerned with ideas like reality, with ideas like truth, ideas like existence. It asks questions like, what is the nature or what are characteristics of reality? What is existence? What is being? Things like that. And epistemology, on the other hand, asks questions about knowledge. How can we know? What is knowledge? Things like that. Okay. So, for us, a philosophical position, a philosophical stance, the basis of our theoretical foundation has always different assumptions about knowledge and different assumptions about reality. Okay? The different assumptions that we have about knowledge and the different assumptions that we have about reality lead to certain kinds of philosophical positions. These philosophical positions can be classified in different ways as philosophy in and of itself. And for us, we will look at 3 different stances, 3 different positions. The one is positivism, the other one is critical realism, and the third one is social constructionism. Now, an important point here is that although we usually talk about these more in qualitative research than we do in quantitative and other types of research, these are the foundations for all type of research. Even if we don't mention them, they are there. Okay. Before we move on, any questions so far? No? I have a question. What is epistemology concerned with? Yeah. Exactly. So it focuses on knowledge. And what is ontology concerned with? Yeah? Reality. Reality, truth, existence. Very basic things we usually don't question. Okay. Now we have sort of ontological assumptions about reality, and we have epistemological assumptions about knowledge. When we mix these assumptions together, we get different types of positions. If you look at it on a continuum like this, you would have something like naive realism on one end. This is sometimes, maybe not naive realism, but realism itself is sometimes a synonym for positivism. And you would have strong relativism or relativist positions on the other end. And relativist position would be social constructionism. And somewhere in the middle, you would have something like critical realism. Okay? Now, we will go through these. We will go through 3 positions that you can take and talk about them in a very basic way, in a simplified way. Most of the stuff is a simplification. Why is it a simplification? Because in the literature you will have, or in philosophy, they will discuss these things in way more detail, with way more differentiation compared to what we do right now. But for us, it's enough when we understand the basic assumptions of these positions. Now, the first position that you can also choose in your final report is the position of positivism. They sometimes call it realism as well. This is often associated with quantitative research, but you can also do it in qualitative research, depending on which kind of literature you read and who you ask. The most basic idea of positivism or realism is this: there is one truth, there is one reality, there's one existence. Okay, this is the basic idea. It's an idea about truth, so it is the ontological position here. The ontological position of positivism is there's one truth, okay? Also, a epistemological position, epistemological assumption is that we can capture the truth with our methods, with our sense perception, with some sort of objective collection of data. So, ontological position of positivism, there's one truth. Epistemological position of positivism, we can capture this truth with our methods. One idea associated with this is that when we do research, we try to reflect this one truth, this one real word, as much as possible, as objectively as possible, as truthfully as possible. And this was, like, positivism in and of itself was sort of a position that you had maybe 100 years ago, maybe more than that. Nowadays, usually there is no such thing as the positivist position. They call it like a naive position sometimes. Nowadays, the position of positivism is more in a sense of a post-positivism. Now, most of the literature that you will read in qualitative research, they just say positivism, that's why we call it that, or they say realism. But the post-positivist idea, which we mix together today, is that research is also influenced by theory, and research is influenced by context, and research is influenced. So our sort of focus would be to remove some biases, as they call it in quantitative research, like any type of subjective influence. We need to remove that as much as possible, and that's what makes our research objective or good or whatever. Now, here are other assumptions of these positions as well, of realist positions as well. If you are interested in those, you can look them up afterwards. For us, they are not of much interest. For us, it's important. Positivism assumes that there's one truth, and so this is the ontological position, and it assumes that we can capture this truth. Being able to capture this one truth, this is the epistemological position. Does it make sense? Perfect. So when we do realist or positivist qualitative research, we will, because we assume that there's one truth, one reality that we can sort of grasp, we try to capture and reflect a phenomenon in the real world. We try to reflect something in the real world that we assume that we can really grasp, that we can collect data about. And when we find data, we assume that there's that between our data and reality, that these two correspond as much as possible. Data directly represents reality. One way, or no, not one way, but one thing that qualitative research that does, like one thing that positivist qualitative research will do, is that it tries to separate the researcher and also the research, like the research subject. They will try to separate those from the methods. Okay, they will try to be as objective as possible. They will try to use certain kinds of methods to be as objective as possible. This was the realist, the positivist position. So there's one truth, and we can capture this whole truth. Completely other end of the spectrum. This is a position we call, it's social constructionism, relativism, but in this class we call it the evil position. I'll tell you why in a bit. This is often associated with qualitative research, and yeah, it assumes that all knowledge is constructed. So there is no one truth, one reality. There's no such thing. Any kind of truth, any kind of knowledge that we have about truth, it is produced, it is constructed, it is sustained by social processes, by subjective processes, by people in some sense. And whenever sort of social processes change, whenever paradigms change, whenever theories change, truth changes. Okay? So we don't have one truth. We have sort of a lot of different constructed realities. And we can never get beyond these constructions. because there's no such thing as one truth. That means that we understand the world always in a context, always in some sort of specific cultural context or social context or political context or moral or ideological context or whatever kind of context. And we will never take any kind of knowledge for granted. Any knowledge that is produced in some sort of context by some sort of subjects in relation to something. Okay, so when we do social constructionist qualitative research, we will not look for a truth or something like that. We don't even strive for objectivity in any sense. What we do is we look at constructions, how people attach meaning to certain kinds of things, how they construct versions of reality. And while we look for constructions, we are constructing reality. We are interacting with the world. What we study here is usually, we focus a lot on language, on discourses, on meaning, on these kinds of things. Now, there are two positions here on this slide. You have like radical social constructionism and more moderate social constructionism. This distinction is not too important for you. And in fact, most of these distinctions aren't. Like, there are a lot of different realist positions and a lot of different constructionist or relativist positions and a lot of different critical realist positions or contextualist positions. These distinctions are not that important for you. The important thing for you in social constructionism is the following. Social constructionism assumes that there's not one truth, but multiple constructed realities. Therefore, we can't know really in any way. We can just look at constructions, at language, at meaning, at these kinds of things. And one idea that you will find a lot in social constructionism and in a lot of different qualitative research textbooks is that language is prescriptive, not descriptive. So we are not just talking about things, but while we talk about things, while we sort of create certain words, these interact in some sense. They create certain types of realities. Question?
Would you then say that like mathematical discoveries or principles or physical theories, that would be realism then?
Mathematical theories, what else?
And like in physics theories.
Like gravity and stuff.
Like gravity,
Yeah, I don't know. How about, it will depend on the theories, I'm assuming. Because think about, and I have no idea about physics, by the way, but let's think about one example. What is this cool theory that everyone keeps talking about where things keep changing, quantum theory and things like that? Don't know anything about this, but is there an underlying truth there, or what are the assumptions there? I can tell you this, that when we think about realism and positivism, it's usually more associated with the natural sciences. And when we think about constructionism and relativism, it's sometimes, maybe not usually, but often it is more associated with social sciences and even psychology and things like that. You have certain kinds of fields that are sort of split. You have, for example, psychology, where you have very positivist ideas and concepts and theories like personality and these kinds of things. And on the other hand, you have like critical psychology, which focuses on things like constructions and meanings that people attach to certain things. Why do we call this the evil position? First, the most radical way of looking at relativism would be there's no truth, right? So the assumptions, the basic assumption of relativism is there's no truth. But if my basic assumption is there's no truth, then there's at least one truth that there's no truth. You know what I mean? So so it's inconsistent in some way. Now there's a lot of discussion around this, and there will be a lot of arguments against this. But this is why we call it the evil position in sort of a assumption sense, but we call it the evil position for you specifically because in the past, whenever students chose the social constructionist position, they had bad grades. So we don't recommend you choosing the social constructionist position for your final report. You can do it, but I can tell you that in the past, there were a couple of bad grades related to that. And this is due to the difficulty that you will have in interpretation, because if you don't read much about social constructionist research and are not familiar with the sort of processes of interpretation, it's always tougher to do an analysis from a social constructionist position. So our recommendation is, at the end of the semester, don't choose the evil position. Make sense? Okay. Now there's also something in between. Something in between, there's one truth and we can capture this truth fully, objectively and everything, and something and there's no truth and there's we can only look at discourses and constructions and meaning. And this something in between, this is one thing that is in between, there are others as well, is critical realism. Critical realism is associated with qualitative and mixed methods research. By the way, all of these positions are associated with all kinds of research, except maybe some certain type of very relativist constructionist positions. But in critical realism, our ontology, our idea about truth is there is one truth, but our epistemology, our idea about knowledge is that we can never completely know this one truth. Okay? So we are relativists in an epistemological sense, but we are realists in an ontological sense. This is often viewed as a nice middle way between the other two positions, and especially in health sciences, this is used a lot, at least you will find it often in health science literature. And one thing that sort of follows from these two basic assumptions is that the truth about whatever can never be fully captured, but only sort of always partially accessed in some sense. So when we have multiple theories on the same topic, both of them can be true. Some of them might be truer than the others, but multiple theories about the same thing can be true. This is one thing that follows here. The other points here, for example, the idea that reality is important to produce knowledge that makes a difference, that's an argument related to intervention and change. So if I assume that there's one truth, one reality, I can make things change in some sense. Critical realism, but all kinds of qualitative research, but specifically critical realism, it focuses a lot of context, focuses a lot of mechanisms and how certain mechanisms happen in certain contexts. It focuses a lot on processes and how to describe processes and sort of analyze them. In critical realist qualitative research, what we will focus on is underlying structures. Again, it's mechanisms, processes, things like this. And similar to constructionist research, it won't assume that the data that we have represents a direct truth, but it will ask the data, like, in this specific context, why did I get this kind of data? Here's an example for this. So when we look at research why people smoke cigarettes or things like that, it will sort of focus on social norms as well, and not only at certain kinds of statements that you get from participants, for example. If a participant tells you, hey, I smoke cigarettes because I'm bored or something like that, you will also focus on, okay, what is the context that he told me this in? And maybe there are social norms involved in that, and so on and so on. Here again is a list of other assumptions of this. They are not of that much importance for us. Sometimes we will talk about them throughout the semester, but for now you don't need these assumptions, but you can look them up if you are interested in any of these. For example, process approach of causality is quite interesting compared to what you are used to, which is the variance approach of causality, which you do a lot in quantitative research or in your statistics classes and stuff. This might be interesting. Okay, so these are the three positions that you can choose from at the end of the semester. Just to make sure that you are still with me here. First of all, what is the ontological assumption of positivism, of realism? What are we assuming about truth in positivism or realism? Was the first position? Yeah?
There's one truth.
Exactly, there's one truth. What is the epistemological position in critical realism? Is that on here? I don't know. What is the epistemological position in critical realism? Yeah?
We have to see our measurements or whatever in the context, and that we are not fully can see the real measure.
Exactly. We have to see it in context. Maybe if we have to put it in a simple sentence, something like, we can never fully know something like this, if we put it simply. Okay. And what are the positions of social constructionism, or what are the positions of the evil position? Yeah.
That there's no one truth or multiple truths,
Mm-hmm.
and everything is constructed to the person that is experiencing it, so it can never be completely, like we are unable to capture anything objectively, because as soon as we capture it, it is captured through us, like us in a subjective way.
Exactly. What's interesting here? Or maybe let's make the point after that first, and then we talk about interesting stuff. Not that this is not interesting. So what I told you now is the very basic assumptions of everything that we do, of the studies and everything. But this is not everything what a theoretical foundation is. So the theoretical foundation of your study, of course, starts with things like what is truth, or how many truths do I believe in, or what is the basis of this, what kind of knowledge basis can I have for the study, and things like that. This is the very basic things. But beyond that, another level of theory is things that Maxwell, in your recommended reading, calls conceptual framework. He also calls it theoretical framework. He also calls it idea context. Some of you mentioned this last week, sort of in association with prior knowledge about a certain topic. So your theoretical foundation of your study is more than just the philosophical position of the study. It's, for example, certain definitions that you have about certain kinds of topics, the terminology that you use. It is theories and models, no matter what they be, if they are formal or non-formal, and other types of assumptions that you have. Sometimes even, in some readings, they will say that part of your theoretical foundation or conceptual framework is also your background and your prior beliefs and things like that. But we will talk about this more tomorrow when we speak about reflexivity and positioning or positionality. But these are different kind of quotes from different method literature, where they talk about what is also part of a theoretical foundation. So it's not just the philosophical stances or ontological stances or epistemological stances. It is also certain types of theories, models, definitions, and things like that. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions on this? Is that understandable? Yeah. Now, yeah. Why do you think are we doing this? Why do you think are we talking about philosophical positions and things like truth and existence and knowledge? Why are we talking about this? Yeah. Mm-hmm. The implicit assumptions of knowledge and truth, they underlie the research that we do. But why don't keep it implicit? Because we could just do studies like normal people. Don't talk about philosophy and stuff, but collect data, do some analysis, do a publication, call it a day. Why are we talking about these kinds of things? Yeah?
Research that we do informs actions as well. So then in order to evaluate whether what we have found is truth or knowledge or whatever, it has impact on our on following steps based on our research.
So research is action as well, and to evaluate if the action was right in some sense or good, it would be very helpful to know good in what way in some sense maybe, yeah? It's a great point. What else? What else? No, there are no wrong answers here actually. I could say a lot of things why we talk about this. Maybe we are just bored. Yeah?
Maybe it's good to just consider it in your own discussion of your research and just like be aware of it, and maybe then you can put it in your discussion, maybe talk a little bit about it, and it reflects more a truth of your research to others that don't have a clue about you, for example.
So basically being explicit about it.
Yeah, like it could be a limitation or it could be whatever, and if you're aware of that and like include it, it might reflect a more truthful picture of your research.
So if you're more explicit about your assumptions, you might have a more truthful picture about your research, for sure. But okay, there's a lot of research. I told you that these positions are sort of the positions, the basic positions for most research, including quantitative research. In quantitative studies, at least in most of the studies that I read, there's no talk about philosophical positions and stuff. What does that mean? Does it mean they are like very bad studies and they shouldn't do them anymore and we should abolish quantitative research? Or why is it okay to also do, yeah?
I would assume that they don't look at the meta level.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the qualitative research looks at, because they're like, okay, we have different levels, and they'll be like, we're going to go deeper into this one. But I feel like the quantitative approach already is down here and assumes that we know that you're taking one of several approaches.
Yeah. Beautiful point. So they are not looking at the meta level of things because they already have certain basic presuppositions when they start their research. There's one truth, okay, we can do this and that. So the assumption, there's no need to look at the meta level anymore. The focus is different. So it's not necessarily bad that they are not looking at this. And also, I'm simplifying right now because it's not like it's not like that you have a lot of you have only positivist quantitative research. That's not the case. You have a lot of different kinds of quantitative research as well. And in these discussions that you sometimes will read within things like paradigm wars and stuff under that title, within these discussions you will have a lot of simplification because sometimes you will have a straw man and say, okay, all quantitative research is the same. And you will have a straw man saying all qualitative research is the same, but usually this will need a bit more differentiation, a bit more specific cases to discuss. But yeah, a lot of great points. Now here are a couple points more of why this matters. I think we talked about this last week a little bit, but this week again. So everything, every research field, every paradigm, every research project, every lecture, every investigation, every discussion, even your discussions in your daily life and things like that, they are implicitly and sometimes explicitly based on certain types of philosophical assumptions, on theoretical assumptions about, for example, definitions. I mean, the discussions that you know of within your field of the health sciences is, for example, the idea of biomedical and social perspectives. Now, biomedical perspectives are sometimes more materialist, and they have often a positivist basis to them as they're assuming one truth, and that we can change this truth in some sense. We can intervene there. And then you have a couple of different social science perspectives, some of which are constructionist, and that they assume that there are multiple realities, and they focus a lot on meaning and things like that. Here's another example in the fields of psychology, behavioral psychology, and the whole associated neuroscientific research that is in there. And discursive psychology is a more constructionist kind of psychology. And you mentioned this, methods can only be applied correctly if we know their basic assumptions. Otherwise, we're doing something wrong in some sense. And you mentioned this also. If you know your position, you know what you think about truth and what you can sort of capture, then your conclusions, you will know how true your conclusions are, how good your conclusions are, if they reach the goal of the position that you are in. That's what will happen if you know your position. That's why we talk about this. Okay. How does this relate to qualitative research? In a lot of different ways, and we will mention this in data collection, we will mention this in data analysis, and we will mention this in evaluating research at the end of the semester. But theoretically, how it relates to it, this is in your recommended reading, it leads to different kinds of distinction about research. One distinction that you have that Brown and Clark mention is the distinction of big Q qualitative research and small Q qualitative research. I'm mentioning this because sometimes you will get across something like this in the literature, so you know what it is. The idea of big Q qualitative research is that you sort of apply qualitative methods, techniques, ideas within the frame of qualitative research. The frame is usually something more on the constructionist end, more on the relativist end, and not too much on the positivist realist end. The other term here is small q, qualitative research. And small q qualitative research sort of is conducted in a frame of quantitative ideas and quantitative thoughts. Again, I'm simplifying. There's no such thing as one quantitative idea and one qualitative idea. But things like, did you hear about this, or did you learn about the evidence hierarchy in quantitative research? You got like a pyramid, and what was the least, I mean, the highest kind of evidence that you could have with this evidence hierarchy was something like systematic reviews and meta-analysis about intervention studies or something like that. And then below that you had something, and then below that experimental research or randomized controlled trials. Below that you would have something like longitudinal research, and somewhere at the bottom you would have qualitative research. Okay, so it's the lowest level of evidence that you could have. Within this frame would be qualitative research. And sometimes qualitative research is conducted within this frame, sort of as a support for quantitative data. Hey, we did a quantitative study here, and we don't know what this really means. Let's ask 3 people. Qualitative research, something like this. And the way you would evaluate the qualitative research here, of course, would be with quantitative evaluation criteria, things like external validity or internal validity for that matter, or reliability, or if you can replicate the kind of things that you do. Then you will have qualitative research where you try to sort of use data collection techniques that are very similar to each other. So don't change the context as much as possible. Try to be as objective as possible. Maybe let a robot ask the questions and not us, because we could change our voice or anything like that. So that way you would have qualitative research within a quantitative frame. That's what they mean by small q qualitative research. But it's not like a very specific kind of definition or something like that. But just that you know there's like this differentiation, big Q and small q qualitative research. There are other differentiations as well, other distinctions as well. Another distinction that we have is the distinction between experiential and critical qualitative research. Again, this is something that you will find in the Brown and Clark book, and I think in the Willick book too, but you will find it for sure in the Brown and Clark book. And when we look at experiential qualitative research, it will focus on experiences, it will focus on sort of views, perspectives, practices, things like that. And these will be assumed to have some sort of relation to one truth. And then you will have more, they call it critical research, and this is more like you won't take anything for granted that your participants tell you. You will think, okay, these are constructions within a certain type of social setting that we are in, and things like that. Now, this doesn't mean that other types of research are not critical. I mean, every quantitative study will have some critical element to it. No researcher will tell you, hey, we're doing uncritical research. Every researcher will tell you that it's critical, but what it's meant here, like what is meant here with critical, is things that are moving more towards the relativist direction of epistemology and ontology. quick note on terminology here. The way we could ask you about this in your final report is the following. We could ask you, choose a philosophical position. We could also ask you, choose an epistemological position. We could also ask you, choose a ontological position. We could ask you, choose a... No, we won't ask conceptual framework or anything like that, but just for you to know. We could ask you in the final report something like, hey, choose a philosophical stance or philosophical position, epistemological stance, epistemological position, or ontological stance, ontological position, which all mean the same, okay? So if you read that at the end of the semester, don't worry if it's epistemological. That doesn't mean that you have to come up with some sort of other terminology. You will choose positivism, you will choose critical realism, and you won't choose the evil position, okay? Okay. Now, we talked about this a little bit already. And this is always a little bit of an eye-opener of how basic assumptions about research sort of relate to our practices within studies and study designs and things like that. So if we assume that there's one truth, and we sort of can capture and grasp this truth with our methods, with our sense perception, with our observations, whatever it might be, of course our focus will be on standardization. Of course we will try to have robots interview people. Of course we will try to sort of remove confounders and biases, to have the most clean and sterile kind of environment to get to our results or findings or whatever, to sort of test our hypotheses. A lot of quantitative research does this, and some small q qualitative research does this. Now, if we assume, okay, there's one truth, okay, but we can never fully sort of capture this truth, which is the idea of critical realism, or which are the ideas of critical realism, then we will try to look at mechanisms, and we will try to explain the context, and then we will see what other theories said about the mechanisms and context, and we will come with our own theory about this thing, and then we will compare. We will see, okay, does this make more sense, or does this make more sense? Maybe both are true to some extent, but we don't know which is true for now. And if we assume that there is not one truth, but a lot of different realities and everything is constructions and meanings, of course what we will focus on is meaning and language. And we will attach meaning and language to meaning and language in some sense. Now, the last point here is important and interesting and relates to our exercise from last week. In each approach, based on these different assumptions, these terms down there, theory, method, quality criteria, they will mean something different. They will mean something completely different according to the different kinds of research positions. Okay. How does this relate to qualitative research practice? I need to preface this by saying, let's say we are together assuming that qualitative research focuses on understanding or some sort of in-depth understanding or nuance or whatever, and it doesn't focus on hypothesis testing. That's what we're assuming is qualitative research about. One thing that you will notice in these studies is that they use softer language. They say things like, this may mean, it could be that. Something that you learn, at least that's what I learned in basic research classes, you shouldn't include words like could, may, might. You should be like more, this is how it is kind of wording. And we'll do a little exercise in a bit on that. It also sort of follows from these basic assumptions, at least the assumptions that there is, that we can't fully capture the truth or that there is no truth. From these assumptions, something that follows is that we are more flexible in our approaches. We will try to adapt our process based on the reality or the realities that we come across during our study. And the third thing that follows from this is that subjectivity in research will be acknowledged, at least in non-positivist positions. Subjectivity in research will be acknowledged. And the way we acknowledge subjectivity in research is something we call reflexivity or positionality. We won't talk about this at all today, but this will be what tomorrow's exercises are about. Why are we not talking about this today? Because we won't ask you anything about reflexivity in your final report. It's very important. In fact, it is something sometimes considered sort of a quality criterion, But for your final reports, it's not part of it. That's why it's in the exercises and not today in the seminars. Okay? Okay, let me very quickly tell you what we want from you in the final report. First session, I told you, you will have to have some sort of an introduction. In this introduction, you will sort of explain and present your topic, and your topic will be sort of determined by the data that we give you. And you will present your research question. For your research question, from everything that I saw in your grade improvement test, looking fine. But again, it should fit your method of analysis. We will talk about this. It should be formulated with a question mark at the end because it is a question. And it should be applicable to qualitative research topics. That was last week. Now this week, a new information that you get for this final report is the following. You will choose a stance for your analysis. This will be positivist or critical realist, not the evil one. And you will have to describe what it means. What do I mean by describe what it means? For example, if you choose positivism, you say, for this report, I'm choosing the positivist, or for this analysis is based on the positivist position. The positivist position assumes that there is one truth and that we can fully capture the truth with our methods or whatever. Or you chose critical realism, you describe, okay, you don't have that much space to describe it. It will be maximum a couple of sentences. You will say something like, critical realism assumes that there is one truth and that we can never fully know this whole truth. Therefore, multiple theories about the same thing could be true in some sense. This will be a description. And you will have to justify why it fits your approach or your analysis. And this is something you can very easily do when we talk about the analysis, different types of analyses, because one type of analysis that we will present to you fits everything. So your justification will be something like, I'm choosing the critical realist position. Critical realism assumes that there's one truth and that we can never fully know this truth, blah, 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 blah. And then I'm choosing thematic analysis or whatever kind of analysis because of its flexible method that can be used for multiple different positions. And then you're good. This is what you have to do for the philosophical position. All right. Are there any questions about this before we move to our little exercise, our little game that we play? Are you good on this? Does it make sense? That's great. Beautiful. In case there are any questions, we can talk about it tomorrow too. We can talk about it for the rest of the semester, actually. But the best way to get a feeling for these is really to read about the different positions or read studies written from these different positions. That's a good way of learning more about it. Okay? Perfect. Then let me stop this recording real quick. And let's play a little game. Let's say a 5-minute break before we start with our game. And then we are nearly done for today.